At the glass pavilion, Amanda loudly clinked her crystal wine glass. She casually announced to our table of 14 that Christopher would be covering the entire $1,694 bill. I stood perfectly still, no panic. Just a wave of absolute inner clarity as Christopher automatically reached for my evening clutch. I refused to flinch. I didn't pull the bag away, and I certainly didn't stage a tearful, desperate argument in front of the country club elite. I simply stood there, breathing evenly, as he expectantly held out his hand. When I didn't move, he reached over, unzipped my clutch right there at the table, and confidently searched for the familiar plastic that had funded his family's delusions of grandeur for years. He pulled out the joint credit card. He didn't know it yet, but I had permanently closed that account. It was a completely dead piece of plastic, a cancelled subscription to their luxurious lifestyle. His brow furrowed in confusion as he examined it, likely expecting to see our names gleaming under the chandelier light. I didn't wait for the inevitable moment he tried to hand it to the staff. I didn't wait for the terminal to decline. I stepped away from my chair, my movements sharp and methodical, bypassing my husband and his mother entirely. I walked directly up to the server standing near the terrace doors. From the hidden pocket of my blazer, I withdrew my brand new, entirely independent debit card. I looked the server in the eye and instructed him to split the check cleanly in half. I would pay for exactly what Christopher and I had consumed. Not a single penny more. The crisp sound of my new card running through the payment machine was the loudest noise in the room. Immediate shock rippled across the table of 14 high society guests. Conversations died instantly. Amanda's manufactured smile froze, her wine glass halting halfway to her lips. Her affluent friends exchanged wide-eyed, intensely uncomfortable glances, the clinking of silverware completely silenced. Christopher stared at the dead joint card in his hand, then up at me, the colour draining completely from his face. They weren't shocked by what they had tried to do to me. They were shocked that I had finally stopped playing along. This wasn't a messy domestic dispute. It was an immediate restructuring of assets. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. For years I had been the silent investor in their version of family, quietly footing the bill for their prestige. Tonight, the board was stepping in, and funding was officially cut. I took my copy of the receipt with steady fingers, tucked my new independent card away, and looked back at the table with cold precision. I didn't owe them a single explanation. I didn't ask why. I just executed the transaction. The unyielding reality of their financial situation had just been delivered, and my retaliation was complete. As a Chief Forensic Auditor, I hunt down financial discrepancies for a living. I track hidden assets, expose corporate fraud, and find the exact money people try to bury. But the most insidious frauds are the ones perpetrated inside your own home. When I finally opened my laptop to audit my own marriage, the numbers told a devastating story of systematic betrayal. Exactly $38,824. That was the precise amount Christopher had systematically funneled out of our shared accounts over the past 2 years. He had classified these transfers in our ledgers as recurring family estate maintenance, country club assessment fees, and minor family healthcare deductibles. It was a phantom ledger built entirely on lies. The reality was that my income was heavily funding his family's country club lifestyles. My hard-earned capital paid for their lavish dinners, their golf outings, and their extravagant weekend trips. It is terrifying how easily cruel behaviour becomes normalised when it is dressed up as family obligation. They had built a psychological trap, slowly conditioning Christopher to believe that his mother's social standing was his financial responsibility, and conditioning me to accept that asking questions about our joint accounts was somehow an attack on their family values. This is the trap of cruel normalization. It doesn't happen all at once. It starts with small requests, tiny guilt trips, and minor financial favors. Before you realize it, the abnormal becomes routine. You begin to accept financial parasitism as a standard condition of the relationship. They manipulate your empathy, turning your willingness to help into an open line of credit. I realized that my love had been commodified. I was not a wife. I was a revenue stream. I didn't cry when the spreadsheet finally balanced and the full extent of the theft stared back at me from my screen. I didn't break down or scream. I simply verified the data. Emotion is the enemy of accounting, and anger wasn't loud this time. It was entirely clinical. I had spent 2 years ignoring the subtle red flags because I wanted to believe I belonged to this family. But the numbers do not care about feelings, and the data was irrefutable. Christopher was a willing accomplice in his family's parasitic economy. He had traded our financial security to sponsor his mother's manufactured prestige. I exported the financial logs, backed up the transaction histories to a secure external drive, and printed physical copies of the ledgers. I wasn't preparing for an emotional argument. I was preparing a dossier. I documented the precise financial leak, line by line, date by date. The justification for my retaliation was absolute. They had stolen $38,824 from my life, and I was going to shut the entire operation down. Retaliation in high society rarely comes in the form of a direct confrontation. It comes as a weaponized spotlight. By the next morning, Amanda had launched an aggressive public relations campaign against me. My phone buzzed continuously with notifications. She had taken to Facebook, leaking carefully worded, passive-aggressive updates to her private country club groups about the profound tragedy of cold, heartless outsiders who simply do not understand the sacred bonds of family values. She didn't use my name, but in her country club circles, she didn't have to. The implications were brilliantly clear. I was painted as the ungrateful, calculating villain who had publicly humiliated her generous son. Her daughter, Stephanie, highly entitled and desperate to maintain her status as an aspiring social media influencer, immediately jumped into the comment sections. Stephanie unleashed a barrage of toxic remarks for her followers to see. She wrote paragraphs about how money changes people, implying that my professional success had stripped me of my humanity and basic decency. They were trying to shame me into submission. They wanted me to panic, to apologize, to write a massive check, to smooth over the public embarrassment. It was their standard playbook. Apply intense social pressure until the target yields. When Christopher finally came home that evening, he didn't bring apologies. He brought gaslighting. He stood in our living room, pacing back and forth, and actively tried to manipulate the narrative. He told me I had severely overreacted. He claimed his mother was just incredibly sensitive about her social standing, and that my public display at the restaurant had broken her heart. He tried to convince me that the missing $38,824 was just a series of minor misunderstandings. He insisted it was a temporary loan that he had every intention of paying back, completely ignoring the fake emergencies he had fabricated. He looked at me with those practiced, pleading eyes and told me I was destroying our family over a simple mistake. I watched him perform his routine. It was a fascinating display of weakness and avoidance. He fully expected me to cave, to take the blame, to internalize the intense guilt his mother was projecting onto me. He expected me to act like a devastated wife trying to desperately save her failing marriage. But I was no longer operating as a wife. I was operating as a Chief Forensic Auditor, evaluating a breached contract. I didn't engage with his emotional theatre. I didn't defend my precise actions at the restaurant. I didn't argue about Amanda's relentless Facebook posts or Stephanie's toxic influencer aspirations. I simply packed a suitcase, picked up my briefcase containing the printed financial ledgers, and walked toward the door. I left him standing alone in the center of the room, still trying to spin a web of lies that the data had already destroyed. The villain's escalation had failed. The spotlight they tried to weaponize against me only illuminated their own desperate need for my capital. They believed social media comments and country club gossip could override cold, hard bank statements. They were operating on emotion and ego, while I was operating on evidence. I stepped out into the night, my mind entirely focused on the next sequence of events. The domestic dispute was over. The professional escalation was about to begin. I completely refused to engage in their emotional theatre. When people try to manipulate you with public shame, the most lethal response is absolute clinical silence combined with devastating legal action. By Monday morning, I was sitting in the polished conference room of an aggressive legal firm. I handed the senior partner my meticulously organised dossier. We didn't discuss my feelings. We discussed strategy, asset protection, and formal demands. Within 48 hours, my legal team issued a formal forensic demand to Christopher. We forced a complete, legally binding accounting of the joint line of credit. Furthermore, I completely redirected my primary income to a brand new, independent bank and revoked his authorised access to any of my personal accounts. The tap was shut off, the funds were locked. The sociological dynamic of families like Amanda's is fascinating and pathetic. It is the illusion of power from an empty wallet. They project an image of untouchable superiority, cloaking themselves in country club memberships and designer labels to mask their profound lack of internal value. They believe their perceived social status grants them authority over those who actually produce real capital. But their entire existence is a rented facade. When you strip away the money they systematically siphon from others, they possess nothing. They have no intrinsic worth, no genuine power, and no true financial leverage. They survive by feeding off the guilt and obligation of people like me. But the moment the host cuts off the supply, their entire ecosystem collapses. They are terrified of the law because the law does not care about social media status, entitled influencers, or country club gossip. The law operates exclusively on facts, documented transactions, and ledgers. When the legal freeze took effect, the panic from my husband's family was instantaneous. The unyielding reality of their empty wallets crashed down upon them. They had spent years pretending to be upper-class royalty while literally living on my primary income. Now, they were facing a forensic demand that would legally force a complete accounting of their fraudulent lifestyle. The domestic dispute had officially shifted into an ironclad professional arena. I reviewed the legal filings with the same detachment I used when auditing a corrupt corporation. Christopher had believed that his maternal guilt could override his marital obligations. Amanda had believed that her country club entitlement made her immune to consequences. Stephanie had believed that her social media followers could intimidate me into submission. They had all severely miscalculated. My attorneys aggressively pursued the joint line of credit, demanding every receipt, every transfer, and every hidden transaction. The systematic legal structure I put in place left them absolutely zero room to manoeuvre. There were no loopholes, no emotional appeals, and no exits. The legal freeze locked Christopher out of my capital entirely. The professional escalation was moving with relentless speed, stripping away their arrogance and replacing it with the cold, hard dread of financial accountability. I sat back and let the lawyers do their work. When you turn a team of forensic accountants loose on a tangled web of lies, the truth always bleeds through the spreadsheets. It took my legal team exactly 9 days to uncover a deep structural deception hidden beneath Christopher's phantom emergencies. The $38,824 he had stolen from me wasn't just squandered on country club lunches or spa days. It was part of a highly calculated, criminal twist. The data revealed a secondary lien. The money Christopher had systematically funneled out under the guise of fake veterinary bills and medical crises had been deliberately routed through a hidden channel. Amanda had secretly used my stolen capital to clear massive title liens on a luxury lake property. That was bad enough, but the lethal discovery lay in the deed transfer. My forensic team found the property records securely filed with the county clerk. Weeks before the restaurant incident, Amanda had legally signed that newly cleared lake property entirely over to Stephanie. She had taken my money, laundered it through Christopher's misplaced filial loyalty, used it to secure a highly valuable asset, and then handed that asset completely to her entitled daughter. It was a textbook move to shield the asset from Christopher's future marital liabilities, assuming I would never dig deep enough to look. She had totally cut Christopher out of the equation. He had actively stolen from his own wife to enrich his mother, and his mother had immediately betrayed him to enrich his sister. My husband was not just a thief, he was an expendable pawn. Amanda had gaslighted him into committing financial fraud against me, only to leave him with absolutely zero legal claim to the luxury property he had helped secure. She had stolen my capital, while fundamentally breaking her own family dynamic. This wasn't just a toxic family manipulation anymore. This crossed the strict threshold into criminal deception and asset forgery. The sharp, high-impact investigative exposure completely removed any lingering path to redemption for the antagonists. There would be no couples counselling, no tearful apologies, and no peaceful reconciliation. They had concealed massive asset transfers and deliberately conspired to defraud me of my earnings. When I read the final forensic report, I didn't feel a single shred of pity for Christopher. He had chosen his mother over his wife, and his mother had played him for an absolute fool. The trap they had built for me had just snapped shut on their own necks. I authorised my attorneys to draft the final separation agreement, explicitly detailing the forged asset transfers and the stolen $38,824. I printed the county clerk's deed transfer, placing it neatly in a manila envelope. Every single transaction was meticulously mapped out, forming an undeniable chain of evidence that linked Christopher's theft directly to Stephanie's new lake house. Amanda's grand design to elevate her favourite daughter using my hard-earned money was now fully documented in a pristine legal binder. They had assumed I was just a blind working wife, ignoring the fact that my entire career was built on dismantling financial deceptions. The arrogance required to steal from a Chief Forensic Auditor was staggering, but their arrogance was matched only by their impending downfall. The lethal discovery of the secondary lien was the final nail in the coffin. I secured the documents, feeling the cold weight of absolute leverage. The time for observation was over. The execution of judgment was imminent. They arrived at my new apartment complex on a Tuesday evening, completely unannounced and desperate. My building concierge called up to inform me I had guests. I told him to send them up. I stood in the doorway and watched Amanda and Stephanie step off the elevator. Their country club arrogance was entirely broken. The looming threat of bank fraud exposure had shattered their entitled facade, leaving behind the frantic, hollowed-out look of people facing absolute financial ruin. Stephanie's aspiring influencer confidence had completely vanished. She looked pale and terrified, clutching her designer bag as if it could save her. Amanda, the woman who had publicly mocked me, who had aggressively siphoned my income to fund her delusions, was physically trembling. Her social and financial leverage was completely dead. "Ashley, please," Amanda started, her voice cracking as she approached my door. "We need to talk. You can't let your lawyers submit those forensic findings." I stood perfectly still, my expression unreadable. I didn't invite them inside. "There is nothing to discuss," I replied, my voice stripped of all emotion, delivering the finisher with unyielding, cold finality. "You committed fraud. The audit is complete." Amanda stepped forward, tears pooling in her eyes. It was a masterful performance, but I was no longer buying tickets to her show. "Please," she begged, abandoning all pretense of dignity. "Think about Christopher. Think about the family image. If this goes public, Stephanie will lose the lake property. I could face criminal charges. We'll find a way to give the money back. Just drop the investigation." She was weeping now, openly begging in the hallway of my building. This was the power flip climax, the moment of ultimate emotional gratification. They weren't shocked by my cruelty. They were desperately begging for my mercy. But my scale had been unbalanced for years, and I was finally zeroing the accounts. "You don't have the money to give back," I stated coldly, "and I don't care about your family image." I reached onto the console table just inside my door and picked up a thick manila envelope. I stepped forward and pressed it into Amanda's shaking hands. "These are the finalized asset separation papers, along with a copy of the deed transfer for the lake property and a draft of the civil lawsuit for fraudulent asset transfer. Sign the separation agreement by tomorrow at noon, relinquishing all claims to my remaining assets, or my lawyers will file the lawsuit to seize that lake property immediately." Amanda stared at the envelope as if it were a bomb. "Ashley, you can't do this to us." "I'm not doing anything to you," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper. "This isn't revenge. It was accounting." I stepped back inside and closed the heavy oak door, listening as the latch clicked into place. The unbalanced scale was permanently corrected. Their power was gone, and my retaliation was complete. I walked back into my living room, the profound silence of my apartment standing in sharp contrast to the desperate sobbing echoing faintly from the hallway. I didn't look through the peephole. I didn't second-guess my decision. I simply walked over to my desk and closed my laptop. They had tried to break me down and drain my resources, banking on the assumption that family ties would somehow shield them from the law. They were fundamentally wrong. Handing over those finalized asset separation papers was the most decisive action of my life. I had executed my judgment, and there was no going back. I stand today by the window of my new independent office space, looking out at the sprawling city skyline. The morning light reflects off the glass, and for the first time in years I feel a profound and unshakable sense of inner peace. The storm has entirely passed. Christopher signed the asset separation papers without a single fight. The looming threat of bank fraud exposure was highly motivating. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he remains in weekly counselling. He's being forced to rebuild his entire maturity and sense of self from absolute scratch, finally facing the reality of his passive, conflict-avoidant nature. Amanda and Stephanie's country club arrogance was permanently dismantled. They are drowning in legal fees, frantically trying to liquidate the luxury lake property before the bank sees it. Their unearned social standing evaporated the moment my financial engine stopped running. The numbers were verified, the truth was exposed, and the absolute necessity of cutting ties with systemic entitlement saved my life. But as I look out at the true horizon before me, I find that my heart isn't filled with malice. I've come to realize that holding on to anger is just another way of letting them siphon my energy. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. I don't forgive their actions, but I release the heavy, suffocating hold they had on my spirit. I have learned that numbers never lie, but people often do. It takes immense courage to look at the cold, hard data of your own life, to examine the balance sheets of your relationships, and accept the difficult truth they tell you. Walking away from toxic ties, even when they wear the mask of family obligation, is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-preservation. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you, and you cannot build a peaceful future with people. There is a beautiful, quiet strength in rebuilding your life on your own terms. When I signed those final papers, I wasn't just legally separating my assets, I was reclaiming my worth. I was declaring that my hard work, my dedication, and my love were no longer available for public consumption or private theft. Healing is a quiet, methodical process. It is waking up in a space that belongs entirely to you. It is the deep, validating comfort of knowing that your future is secure because you built it yourself. It is okay to close the ledger. It is okay to demand absolute respect, to fiercely protect your hard-earned capital, and to confidently walk away from those who drain your light. You are allowed to be the sole architect of your own independence, and you deserve a life where your contributions are valued, not stolen. Have you ever felt like the invisible engine funding someone else's unearned luxury? If this story connected with you, hit that share button, subscribe, and drop your experience down in the comments below. Let's stand our ground together.